One of the challenges of being a mindful leader is being compassionate to individuals that we disagree with. And a lot of times, especially when we're the foot soldiers at the beginning of our careers, we find that we are connected to people whose perceptions and tasking don't necessarily match the intention or even the outcome of what's going to happen when we go to execute. In an era where social media algorithms and Google have empowered everybody to think they're an expert on mental health, we may throw around the word toxic leadership a little too freely. So, first, let's put into context that a manager, or perhaps even your chain of command, is trusted by an organization to balance both the mission and manage the team to get the goals accomplished. Most companies or institutions are either trying to get certified, increase their bottom line, or perhaps even just manage a team so that they can advertise and continue growing the company. But ultimately, what happens is that the manager gets one set of instructions, and what we deal with on the ground force is completely different. So, let's talk a little bit about challenging some of our own biases about, are we dealing with toxic leadership? Or are we dealing with people that are maybe giving their attention to a different part of the puzzle and even a bigger picture that gets filtered by the time we get all the information? Now, to put some of that in context, this might actually be why leaders like Jocko Willink and Simon Sinek came to the conclusion that it is the leader's responsibility ultimately to be able to share why what we're doing is important. However, regardless of where we're at in our leadership chain, we always can take ownership of asking why or even educating ourselves so that ultimately, if we grow into a certain position, we're capable of remembering, one, what it felt like to be the person getting tasked with the information or the task, and two, what it felt like when we were the person criticizing the leader. So, with that in mind, here are three questions you can ask yourself in order to determine, do you have a toxic leader, or do you have somebody who maybe communication isn't necessarily their strong suit? Before we hop into our three questions, let's say this: somebody who's using fear and power instead of actually leading by example, probably a toxic leader. But since we got that out of the way and it's one of the simpler things that we can talk about, let's get into this. Are you dealing with somebody who's exploiting you and manipulating you, or are they holding you accountable? Now, there is a huge difference between that. Now, this won't necessarily be new to military service members, but a little bit harder to dial in on the civilian sector of things. If you have somebody that you're afraid to talk to because that promotion is coming up and you're trying to give them truthful feedback on what is and isn't working, but they kind of have that dark cloud of, if you upset me, I'm not going to help you out, you may be dealing with a toxic leader. However, if you have somebody where as you make mistakes, they're coming and actually offering to hold you accountable by telling you that's not meeting the standard, then you may just have a healthy leader who's trying to make sure that you don't actually make so many mistakes, that your job is on the chopping block. That's actually meaningful and a form of caring and something worth taking into consideration. Question number two: are they setting you up for failure, or do they mentor you and train you when you make mistakes? Now, this kind of goes hand in hand with accountability, and fortunately, all of these things are kind of connected. But if you think about it, if somebody sets you up for failure and then uses you as a scapegoat for their ego, you are probably dealing with the toxic leader. At the very least, somebody who's very insecure and may actually be dealing with the toxic leader themselves. Something to take into consideration, because you actually are probably intelligent enough to where you can navigate around those things and avoid knowing that things are sliding downhill so that you can get out of the way. Maybe be a good friend and let your other friends know as well. That way it doesn't hit them on the way down either. Or you might have somebody that's actually willing to mentor and train you. This was actually something that I dealt with, because in the military, a lot of times the tempo that we move at is compared to a fire hose, and it starts at full on from the very beginning. So what happens is a lot of people have one idea of how to do something and how to execute, and then as they start moving up, they start getting tasked with things that they've never been trained on. Now, if you're fortunate like I was to have certain mentors, they'll pull you aside and let you know, you are responsible for these things, but here's how to go about actually doing those things in a way that's going to prevent you from being frustrated and upset moving forward. Is the person wrong for setting you up for failure or not training you? Maybe, but they also might have trusted somebody else on your team to do that portion of the job for them so that they could focus on their job. It doesn't mean that anybody has it out for you. It just might mean that you kind of fell through the cracks. But it's okay, because if somebody's willing to train and mentor you and give you the fuller picture so that you can move forward in a more effective way, that's going to be tremendously helpful. But that is a great way to determine, am I dealing with an egotistical, insecure jerk? Or am I dealing with somebody that's actually trying to help me grow into a position by giving me additional game so that I can move up and move forward? Question number 3, and like I said, all of these are a little interconnected. Does this person blame people every time something doesn't go their way? Or are they setting the standard and leading by example? That seems like a very simple thing to do from our perspective when we're looking up. But sometimes when we're looking down, we actually make assumptions where we think that someone understands something, or that they know that you should be able to communicate with them, not fully understanding that the position that they inherited actually creates some intimidation along the way. That can be incredibly challenging, but it also means that one of the things that we're responsible for doing is looking in the mirror and asking ourselves, am I abusing my position of authority, going back to exploitation and manipulation, or am I actually doing the things that I'm asking other people to do? Or did I model the behavior that I want people to model so that as I moved up, the people who inherited the positions were trained properly, given the proper information, and they know by watching what the standard and the expectation is. If you have somebody who has a do as I say, not as I do mentality, you might be dealing with toxic leadership. If you have somebody that every time something goes wrong, or you tell somebody that you don't understand and they look at you like you're stupid, or in the military actually call you stupid, and you might be dealing with some toxic leadership, or somebody who unfortunately inherited toxic traits thinking that they did the right thing because now they're modeling the behavior of what they saw instead of actually leading by meeting the standard and leading by example. The reality is that we're all very, very different, and we have different experiences at different times. Through social media and kind of an explosion of technology, we're now being exposed to information that people just weren't educated on 20, 30 years ago. I know that because I watched that explosion of technology where people were able to digest essentially a college worth of education on YouTube instead of, going back to the 80s and the 70s. People either had to pick up a book and be self-motivated to educate themselves, or they were just going to do what they saw other people doing. Now, ultimately, we kind of run into these value conflicts in leadership where some people think they're doing the right thing. They think that our generation is soft and that they're going to set this standard of toughness and just drive, 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 drive and be hard. And let's be honest, we know that that's not mindful leadership. In fact, often it's reactionary and it's not very intentional, but we watch people behind closed doors gravitate away from actually being unified by the mission. So those leaders aren't effective. Whereas a lot of times, if we actually come in contact with one or two mindful leaders, while they may not actually hold the position of authority, we're significantly more open to their feedback. We trust them when we have stress or tension, and we look to them to help us overcome obstacles. So always keep in consideration that you're not going to be a follower for forever, but also leadership and mindful leadership isn't necessarily positional, and you don't need somebody to give you a position in order to make a difference in your friends and coworkers and peers' life. So keep in consideration as you move forward. Don't just hop into the emotional cesspool of being like, that person's a toxic leader. Take into consideration the different things that separate a toxic leader from a healthy and mindful leader that may just be willing to challenge you to get better.